A Heroine's Beginning, Chapter 21. The orchestra got set up surprisingly quickly. It was the tuning of the instruments that took the time. After a journey in the carts, they had all gotten very out of tune with each other. So as I waited for them to tune, I assisted some of the maids, who were trying to sort out the music, distributing it to the correct members of the orchestra. Unfortunately, the maids who had been tasked with this could not read very fluently. I overheard them trying to sound out the names of the instruments written at the top of each page. I took control. I sorted the music into various piles, and got the maids to distribute them to the correct person. When we were finally finished, the conductor of the orchestra stood at the front of the players, and told them they would quickly rehearse some of the dances before the wedding celebration tomorrow. He picked up his baton, and beat one bar of 4 time. The orchestra began to play. It was a gavotte. I recognized the melody from the night of the ball. The servants who had come to assist carrying things up to the room had left once the job was done. I knew they had much to do before the next day. I had not noticed that Jack had stayed behind. I felt a tap on my shoulder, and spun around to see his vibrant shock of ginger hair and those strangely colored eyes. He didn't say anything, simply held out his hand, and a silent invitation to dance hung in the air. I lifted my hand and took his. There was no electric shock this time. We made our way to the center of the ballroom quietly, and waited for the music to begin a new phrase. Then we moved forward, stepping in time with the music and each other, turning towards and away from each other as we made our way down the room. Once we reached the end of the room, Jack spun me around himself, and then took hold of my other hand as well. I tried to remember the steps of the dance he had taught me those weeks ago. I found it surprisingly easy to remember. I knew when to spin, when to step away, and when to step back to him. Before too long, the dance had come to an end, and I curtsied to him. He reciprocated with a bow, not letting go of my hands. There was a moment of talking, and then the music started up again, this time a slow waltz. "May I?" Jack whispered quietly in my ear. I nodded, trying desperately to ignore the goosebumps that were forming on the skin of my neck, where he had whispered. I did not know why I was reacting so, but I did not have much time to wonder, as we were beginning to sway in time to the music. Jack's arm circled my waist, and his hand landed on the small of my back. It felt strong and firm. My own hand found its way to his shoulder. The position we found ourselves in made it impossible not to look at him directly. He was slightly taller than me, so at least it kept my head up. The phrase began, and Jack took the lead, stepping to the side. I followed, performing the waltz step just as he had taught me to. The music swirled around us, but I did not know the tune, and I was too distracted to notice. Jack's eyes never left my own. We were moving around the room now, perfectly in sync with each other. His eyes, the strange jewel color that they were wide, and his pupils slightly dilated, making them appear darker. I wondered what was so intriguing about my own eyes. They were a boring gray color, but I did not raise the question. The tone of the music changed and built. The atmosphere changed, and so did our dance. We moved from a basic waltz step, and Jack twirled me around into his arms and back out of them again. We let go of each other for a moment to both move in opposite directions, lifting our arms as the dance demanded. When we moved back together, Jack wrapped both of his arms around my waist and lifted me into the air, spinning me as he did so. It felt like flying. I was too wrapped up in the music at the moment to notice the slight pains in my side where his hands were. My head tilted upward, and I took in the climax of the music and the sensation with my eyes closed. I had no coherent thoughts, just pure bliss for one perfect moment. Jack slowly lowered me to the ground, and I was snapped out of my daze, my feet firmly back on the ground. The waltzing continued, but the music was coming to an end, and so it slowed down. We returned to the basic step, and with one final spin away, the music ended, and I sank into a low curtsy, my head lowered. I needed a moment to regain my breath and collect my thoughts. I had never before experienced a dance quite like that. There was a small clap that came from the orchestra, and I turned my face to them, my cheeks a little red. I gave them a gracious bow of my head and a smile. The applause stopped, apart from one. One solitary person continued clapping in a slow manner. They were not in the orchestra, however, but stood on the far side of the room, in the doorway. Myself and Jack both turned ourselves around to look, and I found myself staring at James. He had no smile on his face, smug or otherwise, just an intense gaze. James began to walk toward us, but not looking at me, looking at Jack. He was too far away, so I could not tell the exact expression on his face, but he was definitely not smiling. "Well done. That was quite a dance, you two," James said. "Thank you," I replied. "And who is this fellow? Marion, I do not believe you've introduced him to me," James asked. "This is Jack," I told him, gesturing to Jack. Jack stuck out his hand in front of him. "Jack Hale," he said. "Sir James Thorne," James told him, grasping Jack by the hand and shaking it. In my mind, I noticed how James had emphasized the "sir" part. "I feel as though I've seen you before," James said. "I'm in the household of Lord Weston. I was here working at the ball," Jack replied. "Ah, you work for Adam. I was his schoolmate at Ashburn," James exclaimed. I was not quite sure, but there was something in their tone of voice which set me on edge a little. "May I ask how you two know each other?" James continued. "I met Marion in the woods on the morning of the ball," Jack informed him. "I taught her how to dance. I believe you enjoyed the fruits of my labor." "How so?" "It was you I saw dancing with Marion at the ball. Am I correct?" "Yes, we spent quite a lot of time dancing that night." There was definitely something in the air now. I could feel it. "So you have me to thank for the fact that she did not fall over or step on you." I could feel my cheeks burning at this point. They seemed to be talking about me a lot, like I was not standing right next to them. I decided to break up the conversation with a loud cough. Both of them turned to look at me, and I could not help but notice the difference between the two of them. Jack was smaller, skinnier, and lighter than James. He had a narrow frame, which made his head appear slightly bigger than it was. The features of his face were narrower, too, but not massively so. His chin came to more of a point, and his entire face was longer than James. The bright color of his untidy short hair made the color of his eyes even more predominant. James, by comparison, was broader and taller, but not massively so. He was well proportioned, and so looked older than Jack. Jack looked a little like he was still waiting to grow into his body. James's darker hair was longer, but kept perfectly neat and tidy. His face was broader, and he had high cheekbones that stood out. James looked very much like the heroes I had always imagined in my head when I read stories. I had to stop thinking of that, as they were both still staring at me. I replied in a quiet voice that I had a tickle in the back of my throat. That was all. It wasn't true, but it was the first thing I could think of to say. "If you don't mind," James began, "may I enjoy more fruits of your labor by dancing the next one with Marion?" Jack didn't say anything. James held out his hand to me, smiling as he did. "My lady, may I?" I took his hand and replied I would. He gave the back of my hand a quick kiss, and we walked to the middle of the room. The orchestra began to play a minuet, and we took up our positions. I glanced back at Jack, who smiled at me. I gave him a small smile in return. I turned around to face James, and he had turned on his charming expression again. The dance began, and we promenaded around the room, hand in hand. I was not quite sure how I felt about this dance. It was very different from the last one, and I was not completely happy with the way James had just spoken to Jack either. I kept my thoughts to myself, and tried to focus on the steps. "Do you know that man very well?" James asked in a quiet voice. "No, I only ever met him once before, but he was ever so helpful." "How exactly?" "You did not see my attempt at dancing before I arrived at the ball. He taught me how to not fall on my face. Were you really that bad? When he found me, I was flat on my face, after failing to perform the polonaise step. James chuckled. So he's simply your dance tutor? Yes, and my friend, I told him. Nothing more? No. Good. Please don't dislike him. I would hate if two of my friends did not like each other. Two of your friends? Who exactly are you referring to? James asked, looking very confused. Jack and yourself, I replied. I had thought I was being very obvious. James's confused expression stayed on his face. I rushed to explain myself. You said earlier that we were friends. You certainly greeted me as a friend. If I was mistaken, I apologize. We can be acquaintances. I did not want to lose his friendship. He was a very entertaining individual, and charming when he wanted to be. I worried that I had gotten the wrong impression of him, and that he didn't want to be considered friends with an unemployed servant girl. James took a second, and then smiled. Yes, of course we are friends. At least until you step on my toes. I can't allow that, he teased. The grandfather clock at the edge of the room began to strike the hour, and I noticed it struck 3 times. Something in the back of my mind told me I had forgotten something. It hit me like a bolt of lightning that I had promised Ella I would be back at 3 for the dress fitting. I dropped my hands out of James's and stepped backward. I'm so sorry. I have to go. Ella is expecting me at 3, I told him. James nodded. Well then, tomorrow we will have to finish this dance, and you still owe me one. He reached forward and gave the back of my hand another kiss. I gave him a quick curtsy. I'm sorry, I said, and began to walk away hastily. As I approached the end of the room, I found myself near Jack again, who looked very confused. I have to go. Ella is expecting me, I told him quickly. Oh, I probably have things to do as well. Maybe I'll see you around the palace. I nodded and said goodbye, and proceeded to walk out of the ballroom, leaving James and Jack both staring after me. I probably ran all the way to Ella's room. I had finally just learnt enough about the geography of the castle not to get lost this time. By the time I burst through the door, I was out of breath and had rosy red cheeks due to exertion. Jacqueline was already there, and offered to get me a glass of water once I almost collapsed into the nearest armchair. Ella was already behind the screen, changing into her dress, but shouted hello to me. Once I could breathe properly again, I made my excuses to both of them. Ella, being the lovely person that she was, told me to think no more of it. Myself and Jacqueline waited in anticipation of what exactly her dress was going to look like. I knew she would look utterly stunning in whatever she wore, but I was still curious to see what exactly she had chosen. How is the food preparation going? I asked Jacqueline. Good. I think nearly everything is ready for tomorrow, she replied. The cook seems to have everything in hand now. There was a moment when we thought we were going to run out of sugar, but the delivery boy was very efficient at getting our order to us quickly. Is the orchestra all ready? She asked. I think so. They sounded very good when I left. I'm still not completely sure what help I was, but they are about ready. Then this should be the last thing to do, and then we're all set, Ella shouted at us from behind the screen. All right, I'm coming out. Ella emerged slowly from behind the screen. Her dress was snow-white. A tight bodice clung to her every curve, pinching to a small point at her waist. Her skirt flared out around her hips and continued into a long train following her. There was a small golden embroidered pattern sewn into the skirt along the bottom of it. A golden sash was tied around her waist in a small bow. Her shoulders were covered only by a long piece of lace that ran around her neckline and draped over her shoulders modestly. The neckline of the dress made a large and wide U-shape. She looked like an angel. What do you think? She asked us. Oh, Ella, you look so beautiful, I said. You really do, Jacqueline added. Ella's face lit up, and she glanced down to admire the dress. The outer skirt comes off. I have to untie the sash, and the entire skirt comes off. There's another one underneath in the same style, that I can wear so I can dance at the celebration without tripping over the train." I felt so happy for her. She looked practically radiant, and it was so nice to see her so happy after all that hardship she had been through. She was marrying the man she loved the most in the entire world, and anyone who saw them together could not doubt the affection they held for each other. In that moment, I was reminded of Sir Henry and Lady Eleanor, and I was sure they were looking down on their daughter from heaven and smiling. All they ever wanted was for her to be happy. They really loved her so, and I was sure if they were still here, they would be overjoyed at the moment as well. The corners of my eyes started to water. Thinking about Sir Henry inevitably made me think of my own mother. I wished that she was still here as well. I had always imagined as a child that if I ever got married, I wanted my mother and father to walk me down the aisle and be happy for me. I was now never going to see that dream realized. Not that I was planning on getting married any time soon. But this was Ella's day. She was the one getting married. She would undoubtedly be missing her parents on such a special day. As much as I tried to control the tide of emotions within me, I did not succeed. A few tears came pouring out of my eyes, and I could not hold them back. Ella immediately looked concerned. "Marion, what's the matter?" I tried to compose myself. "I was just thinking how happy your parents would be right now," I told her. Ella smiled a sad smile as she heard this. Her own brown eyes started to water a little. "Do you really think so?" "Yes, they would be so proud of you, Ella," I told her. I knew it was true. The tears began to pour out of her eyes now, and I moved closer to embrace her. I tried not to crumple her beautiful dress any more than was necessary. After a brief moment, I pulled away from her, and she tried to brush away the tears before they could stain the dress. We both smiled at each other, and Ella looked past my head to Jacqueline and extended her arm. Jacqueline walked closer and joined up in our embrace. "Thank you both so much for everything," Ella said quietly. "I love you both." Neither of us responded. We both knew and reciprocated the feelings. All of us just stood there, feeling excited for the next day and utterly content with the present moment. A smile graced my face. I had a feeling that my mood was only going to improve over the next day, and I looked forward to it